Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is to take you across a border, but it's not one you'll find on any map.
No, this is a border that appeared almost silently in 2025. We're doing a deep dive into a new digital fault line, a strategic divide that opened up between the United States and Europe.
And it wasn't drawn in sand or water. This one was drawn in, well, in code and in policy.
It's an absolutely essential story for understanding modern geopolitics, because the sources we're looking at detail a major confrontation where the fight wasn't over oil or territory or even the usual trade tariffs.
No, the core fight was about speech itself.
Exactly. Who controls it? Who defines it, and maybe most importantly, who gets to regulate the massive platforms that host it.
And the central insight our sources offer is a really critical look at the power strategies of Donald Trump in this specific clash. We're analyzing this highly calculated use of personal exclusion.
An unpredictable action. It was all designed to assert what the sources call digital dominance over Europe's new regulations.
The thesis here is chilling, but it's also brutally effective because it gets right to the heart of how power actually works. The sources argue that Donald Trump understands a fundamental rule. You defend power with examples, not with explanations.
That is the cornerstone of the whole strategy. I mean, when power is challenged, it doesn't really want to debate. It doesn't issue a white paper.
Right.
It demands visible punishment. It uses asymmetrical action to reestablish control and really to force compliance through fear.
And the confrontation we're exploring today, it began with an action that was almost surgical. It was deeply personal. The U.S. denied visas to 5 very prominent European policy architects.
A calculated message, not aimed at an institution like the EU Commission as a whole, but at the people, at individuals.
We're going to trace this whole thing for you from that initial divergence of interest all the way to the systemic fallout, which, as we'll see, created this new era of self-policing among European regulators.
The complexity is huge, but the strategic clarity of the U.S. action is, you have to admit, remarkable. So let's start at the beginning. Let's unpack the foundational shift that even made this possible.
To really get this digital fault line, you have to start with the idea of a border. I mean, the sources hit you right away with this powerful concept. History tends to punish people who think power is just about geography.
You know, rivers, walls, seas. For thousands of years, that's what a border was, a physical line. But by 2025, that just wasn't the whole story anymore.
The shift was subtle. You couldn't see it, but its implications for sovereignty were, and are, absolutely massive.
The new border didn't show up on a map. It materialized inside databases, on regulatory dashboards, and, most powerfully, inside immigration control systems.
And the sources pinpoint the exact moment this new kind of border was drawn. It was when 5 high-level Europeans were banned from setting foot on American soil, even though they hadn't even gotten on a plane.
That's a stunning demonstration of what modern state power looks like. You can be, for all intents and purposes, erased from a country with a single keystroke.
It takes that old diplomatic concept, persona non gratas, and it just completely weaponizes it for the digital age. The exclusion is instant. It's absolute.
And it's the ultimate expression of controlling access. What's so critical here is the psychological impact of that. The U.S. didn't need to move ships or levy broad economic sanctions to make its point.
They just leveraged the denial of access.
And it was so clearly not a bureaucratic mistake. This was a message calibrated to be understood by every single official, politician, and bureaucrat who deals with American companies or American policy.
A message that ripped right through this long-standing story of the transatlantic alliance. You know, for decades, the Atlantic Ocean was a symbol of shared values, mutual protection.
Fighting together, trading together, all under this banner of democracy. And that history is real, of course. But the sources remind us it's often secondary to a more immediate law of power, which is that alliances are sustained by shared interests, not just shared words or history.
And by late 2024, in the digital world, those interests had clearly diverged.
Seriously diverged. And once that happens, friendship becomes fragile. And when power, American power in this case, feels directly challenged, that friendship can become expendable.
So it sounds like this was a moment of really stark realization for Europe. A wake-up call that the U.S. would put its own digital and economic supremacy first.
Absolutely. Ahead of traditional political solidarity, Europe learned and the sources say they learned it painfully, that when it came to defending its biggest, most influential corporations, these engines of its global influence, the U.S. government would treat regulation from an ally with the same hostility it might reserve for an adversary.
So if that's the catalyst, the divergence of interest, we have to get specific about what the fight was actually over, which brings us to this idea of speech as the new territory.
The sources are completely unequivocal on this. The subject of this open conflict wasn't manufacturing, it wasn't steel, it was speech.
Specifically, who gets to define it, regulate it, and punish it on platforms that are, let's face it, overwhelmingly American in origin.
And this act, the visa ban, it basically established the digital realm, the platforms, the data flows, the algorithms, as the primary battleground between these two democratic blocs.
That raises the stakes so much higher than a standard trade dispute. This is about controlling the narrative, about shaping culture, and, at the end of the day, defining reality for billions of people.
And you had these two irreconcilable views. Europe saw regulation as protecting its citizens and its democracies. Donald Trump, on the other hand, saw that same regulation as a direct attack on American influence.
And that chasm, that philosophical gap, is what set the stage for the escalation we saw in December 2025.
To really appreciate how severe the American response was, you have to look at what Europe was trying to do. This wasn't some snap decision. This was years in the making.
Right. They'd spent all this time constructing this massive, comprehensive digital framework.
The Digital Services Act, the DSA. For Europe, this was meant to be the definitive statement on digital sovereignty. It had sort of three main goals.
Okay, what were they?
First, protect users from illegal content and harm. Second, impose real accountability on the tech platforms for their decisions. And third, and this is the big one, to tame the immense power of those American tech giants.
So when we talk about taming the giants, let's get a bit more technical. What exactly inside the DSA was seen as the biggest challenge to U.S. dominance?
Well, the sources rightly point out that accountability is too vague. The DSA had teeth. Specifically, it mandated what they called radical algorithmic transparency.
Meaning the companies had to explain how their recommendation engines actually worked?
Precisely. They had to explain why you were seeing a specific piece of content. That was seen as a direct intrusion into their core intellectual property, the secret sauce.
It's one thing to say, take this down, but it's another thing entirely to say, show us the engine that runs your multi-trillion-dollar company.
Exactly. And on top of that, the DSA imposed moderation requirements for things that were harmful but not always illegal, like deepfakes or coordinated disinformation campaigns.
So figures like the EU Commissioner Thierry Breton, they were trying to end this era where the platforms acted like untouchable empires.
They wanted to end the rule of the corporate terms of service. The message was, if you operate in Europe, you are governed by Europe.
But the sources suggest that in doing this, Europe made a fundamental miscalculation in the eyes of the Trump administration.
They did. You can't challenge the king unless you have the power to dethrone him. And in the political calculus of Donald Trump, challenging these tech companies wasn't just challenging the corporation.
It was challenging the United States itself.
It's vital to understand his specific worldview on this. The sources say these companies were viewed explicitly as instruments of national strength.
So they weren't just businesses, they were projections of American influence.
American norms, American power, globally. When you control the communication infrastructure, you control the ideas. So any attempt by a foreign power to regulate that is seen as a direct threat to strategic interests.
So when European regulators came knocking, demanding compliance and transparency,
the administration didn't hear a concern for safety. They heard defiance.
And defiance is something that, in this worldview, must be crushed.
Word spreads. The administration successfully reframed a technical policy dispute into an existential ideological fight over sovereignty. And that reframing is what justified the counterstrike.
Let's look at the escalation. The sources really zero in on that symbolic fine against the Platform X.
That was the perfect catalyst. The conflict had been simmering for years. Washington pushing for softer enforcement, Europe refusing to budge. But that fine, I think, is around $140 million.
Which for a company that size is not crippling.
Not at all. The money wasn't the point. The symbolism was everything. Europe said the fine was for failures in transparency, but it didn't matter.
The owner, Elon Musk, immediately framed it as censorship.
And for Donald Trump, who had long talked about a censorship industrial complex, this was just confirmation. It proved his point. This was an ideological war.
That framing is so important. It turns a bureaucratic fight into this high-stakes battle over who decides what acceptable speech is.
And here's one of the deepest insights from the source material. It says, transparency in power struggles is often just another word for surveillance.
Wow.
Europe saw transparency as a tool for accountability. The Trump administration portrayed it as foreign bureaucrats demanding to surveil American viewpoints.
That is brutally effective. It weaponizes America's own free speech values against an ally. It completely flips the script.
It makes the regulator look like the censor. And once you've defined your opponent's governance as ideological control, you can justify any counteraction, no matter how personal.
Which brings us to the action itself. The pivot from policy to personal exclusion. We're at the December 23rd announcement.
The timing alone, just before the holidays, was a signal. The announcement was immediate and absolute. 5 Europeans banned from entry.
And the sources emphasized there was no subtlety. No visas, no exemptions, no quiet diplomacy.
This was not a soft rebuke. It was a clean, unambiguous statement of unilateral power.
And the targets. They weren't random. Who exactly were they?
The selection was surgical. They were the architects of the DSA. The biggest name was Thierry Breton, the former EU commissioner, really the driving force behind the whole thing.
But it wasn't just him.
No, alongside him were 4 other key figures, prominent anti-disinformation campaigners, policy enforcers, a couple of whom were actually British citizens, people who had been deep in the weeds of shaping digital moderation in Europe.
So the message couldn't be clearer. If you regulate American speech, you yourself will be regulated, not by law, but by exclusion.
But to make it stick, they needed a legal pretext. They had to wrap this act of political coercion in the flag of established law.
And that's where Secretary of State Marco Rubio comes in. He gives the official justification.
He does, accusing them of enabling extraterritorial censorship. But the real genius of the strategy was the legal instrument they chose to use.
The Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA.
Specifically, a mechanism inside the INA that lets the U.S. deny entry to anyone whose presence could cause serious adverse consequences for the country.
And this is such a critical part of the deep dive. Why was this tool so much better than, say, economic sanctions?
Because sanctions are messy. They require bureaucracy, they get challenged by allies, they take time. The INA mechanism gives the president instant, legally unappealable unilateral power of exclusion.
So there's no recourse. The decision is made and that's it.
The Secretary of State makes the call, and a foreign national has almost no standing in a U.S. court to challenge it. Access to the country is a privilege, not a right. It maximized the shock value while minimizing any potential legal blowback.
And that phrase, serious adverse consequences, that's the key, isn't it? It's so deliberately vague.
It's perfectly vague. The power of it is that it requires only authority to use, not proof, not a trial, not consensus. It was the cleanest, fastest way for Donald Trump to demonstrate that U.S. authority was absolute and immediate.
So they turned that legal ambiguity into a strategic weapon. And by targeting 5 named individuals, they personalized the threat.
This is that ancient principle of power. Punish 1 to warn 1,000. By banning 5 high-profile people, the U.S. achieved maximum political fear across the entire European regulatory establishment.
Because the humiliation of a personal visa ban is so much more potent than a fine on a government department.
Infinitely more. The sources say the silence that followed the announcement carried this very potent whisper. If it happened to them, it can happen to you.
So every single bureaucrat involved in enforcement starts to calculate their own personal risk.
Exactly. And this reveals the core of the strategy here. It's about weaponizing access. Visas aren't just paper, they're permissions. And in a world where D.C. and Silicon Valley are centers of gravity, permission is power.
Control over who gets to travel, who gets to attend the big summits. That's the ultimate non-military expression of sovereignty now.
The administration successfully redefined access as a privilege, one that was conditional on not challenging core U.S. interests.
So let's shift to the aftermath. The psychological and systemic fallout, which might have been even more significant than the bans themselves. Europe, predictably, reacted with outrage.
The reaction was unified, at least on the surface. France called it coercion, Germany called it unacceptable, Spain called it censorship. But the source material delivers a very harsh lesson here.
Which is?
Outrage is a reaction, and reaction is always weaker than initiative.
The U.S. took the initiative, and Europe was immediately forced onto the back foot.
Without question. Europe could issue angry statements, they could even fine companies, but they had no symmetrical tool. They couldn't force the U.S. to open its borders to those 5 people.
The U.S. border remained what the sources call one of the last absolute expressions of sovereignty.
So even if Europe won the rhetorical war in the headlines, they lost the power play completely. Which brings us to the real goal of the bans: invisible domination through self-policing.
The bans weren't the end of the conflict. They were the signal flare.
And fear arrived quietly. Not in press conferences, but in private calculations inside government offices. Regulators all across Europe started asking themselves, if I enforce this rule, will I be next on the list?
This sounds like what the sources call the darkest truth of power. The most effective domination is invisible. It's when people start policing themselves.
Donald Trump didn't need to ban every regulator. He just needed to convince them all that he might. The power was in the anticipation of future, unpredictable retaliation.
So you see enforcement decisions get delayed, more legal reviews requested, a chilling effect.
Instantaneous and pervasive. And beyond just the fear, the practical disruption was severe. Denying access to 5 key people messes up the whole network.
Summits get canceled, informal diplomacy freezes up.
Exactly. Access to the U.S. is essential for policy coordination. The sources say power isolates before it conquers. By denying entry, the administration successfully isolated the key players in the DSA enforcement network.
And the most insidious weapon in all this was that intentional vagueness we talked about.
That vagueness became a psychological weapon. The deeper terror, as the sources put it, was the precedent. If regulators can be banned for enforcing speech laws, who's safe?
Could academics who publish critical research be next? Journalists.
If extraterritorial censorship is the justification, who gets to define what that even means?
And Donald Trump never had to answer those questions. The silence was the strategy.
Silence amplified them. Uncertainty magnified them. Ambiguity weaponized them. That's a direct quote from the analysis. Clarity sets limits. Vagueness forces your opponent to imagine the worst and act accordingly.
Which leads us to that critical narrative reframing. European leaders were trying to play by the old rules, speaking the language of governance, law, international cooperation.
While the Trump administration spoke the language of survival. This was an ideological war, resisting foreign interference, protecting American viewpoints. And the sources are blunt. When you pit governance against survival, survival always wins.
And the U.S. officials were so clever with their language, essentially co-opting Europe's own arguments.
They did. They started talking about protecting American sovereignty in the digital age. They used Europe's own buzzwords to paint Europe as the aggressor trying to impose foreign control.
It put Europe on the defensive, having to explain why wanting transparency wasn't an attack on freedom.
And now we have to look at the real-world result of all this, the corporate learning curve. The tech companies were the fastest learners in this whole affair.
Their survival depends on sensing where the power is flowing.
And they saw it shift immediately. The risk of a fine, even a big one, was nothing compared to the risk of triggering an unpredictable, personal, retaliatory action from the U.S. government.
So how did they adjust? What did they actually do?
The sources show distinct shifts. Meta quietly adjusted its policies on political ad transparency, trying to comply with the letter of the DSA without giving any political offense. Google increased its selective transparency, but framed it as voluntary cooperation, not mandated compliance.
What about X, the company that got the fine?
They kept up a defiant public tone, echoing the censorship narrative. But internally, they recalibrated. They made sure their resistance to the DSA was carefully balanced so it didn't provoke any more personal bans. And Amazon just poured money into compliance and lobbying.
The lesson was clear. The ultimate authority is the political one that controls your access.
Which brings us to the final crossroads. Europe had to decide: retreat or retaliate. But retaliation assumes you're on equal footing.
And the hard truth is, they weren't. The imbalance of leverage was just too great.
It was fundamentally vulnerable. Europe depends on American platforms, American markets, American cloud infrastructure, and American security guarantees. The U.S. just doesn't have the same level of dependence.
So the Digital Services Act was built on a flawed assumption.
Yes. It assumed shared values and cooperation would continue. It was a law designed for peacetime governance, not for ideological warfare with your most powerful ally.
And once the precedent of exclusion was set, it became a threat across all policy areas.
That's the real terror of the precedent. If they can do it for digital policy, why not climate rules that hurt U.S. industry? Why not trade rules? It was a test of Europe's willingness to escalate.
The sources call this imperial behavior, how a power acts when it fears it's losing control.
Donald Trump was using Europe as a test case. If it worked here, the model could be applied globally.
So as the dust settled, the sources lay out 2 possible futures. The first is fragmentation.
Fragmentation means more tariffs, more visa bans, a total collapse of trust. The internet itself starts to split into zones of influence. A digital iron curtain descends.
And what does that curtain actually look like in practice?
It's technical. It's data localization laws that prevent information from flowing. It's incompatible code and conflicting legal standards. It's a wall built not of steel, but of policy and software.
And the second possible future, a fragile truce.
A truce born from exhaustion, not agreement. Back-channel talks. Compromises framed as mutual victories. Europe softens enforcement. The U.S. promises to shelve the visa ban weapon.
But it's fragile.
Because, as the source says, once power reveals its teeth, it cannot pretend they do not exist. The threat is now a proven, effective tool. The fear of it will linger and shape behavior for years to come.
Which brings us to the final, unsettling realization here. The internet, once seen as this borderless equalizer, has become one of the newest and most precise weapons of state power.
Borders are no longer just lines on a map. They're permissions in a system. They are invisible, absolute, and in this case, completely unappealable.
The whole confrontation was about who defines the rules for the digital world. And Donald Trump answered that question with personal, targeted exclusion. The question for Europe now is whether it can afford to challenge that answer ever again.
Because power, once asserted this effectively, doesn't just voluntarily retreat.
Okay, let's just try and summarize the key takeaways here for you. Donald Trump's strategy, as laid out in the sources, relied on making public, personal examples of those 5 officials. It was all about enforcing narrative control and demonstrating that access. Control over access is the ultimate expression of modern power.
Right. And the success of that strategy really lay in 2 things. First, forcing that mass self-policing through uncertainty. And second, successfully reframing a governance debate as an ideological war for survival. The result is a fundamental and probably permanent fracture of trust between the U.S. and Europe in the digital sphere.
It's a really chilling look at how fast the rules can be rewritten when one side decides that tradition and alliance come second to strategic control. And it forces everyone, in policy, tech, journalism, to rethink their own vulnerability in this new world.
It does. And that leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to take away from this deep dive. If state power can erase you from a global network with a single keystroke, and if silence becomes the price of keeping your access, how long before access itself just becomes the price of obedience?